welcome to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I'm happy that you're all here today. Can you believe it is already December? I am looking out my window and it's snowing, so I can definitely believe it's already December, but I hope you had a great holiday and I hope you got a lot of your essay work done for those of you who are seniors who have not finished all of your application work. The time is ticking. We have a listener Q&A for you today, and that's coming up a little bit later. But before we get to that, we're actually going to be talking about what we're defining as niche colleges. It's not really a technical term. It's one that we are using here at College Coach and on the podcast. And joining me for that conversation is Ben Baum, who's Vice President of Enrollment at St. John's College, which we would consider a niche college. Hi, Ben.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining the show. For those of you who are regular listeners, Ben has been on the show before, but this is the first time he's joining us to really talk about St. John's. So why, in your opinion, is St. John's considered a niche college? It's, as I mentioned, not really a formal or a technical term. So what does that really mean to you when you hear that term?
Sure. And I sometimes use that term. Sometimes I'll refer to us as being distinctive or different or unique. I was actually just listening to a different podcast where I heard Malcolm Gladwell, who's such an interesting thinker on so many topics, including higher ed, refer to St. John's as being among the most distinctive. That's the word he used.
Okay.
But we do things differently from most of higher education. And we aren't a fit for every student. And I think that's something that we know about ourselves and that we embrace. And many colleges out there are trying to appeal to every single student who might come through that door. And yet for us, we have a really distinctive identity and we are true to that identity. And for us, that's all wrapped up in this curriculum we have, what we call a great books curriculum. So we're looking for students who are going to be a fit for this curriculum. And that isn't necessarily every student that's out there. Some students are really drawn to what we do, which involves reading a lot of great books, coming to classes that are small and having discussions about them. It's entirely interdisciplinary. So the books include literature and philosophy. They include math and science. And for some students who know there's only one thing they want to study to the exclusion of everything else, we aren't a fit, and that's okay. For a student who isn't a big fan of reading, we also won't be a fit, and that's also okay. And that, I think, is one of the things that makes us a true niche, is that we aren't in the world to appeal to every single student that's out there. We're trying to find those students who are excited about what we do and really want to be a part of this endeavor together.
Right. It's interesting that you say that because it does feel like most colleges are trying to be all things to all people. And even those that have traditionally been a little bit more niche I've witnessed, certainly over the last maybe 10 years or so, there's one particular school that comes to mind that I won't name here, that has gone from being really focused on having a very specific student body to just trying to be as selective as possible. And I think to the detriment of the institution, because they're no longer attracting that very specific group of students they used to attract. And instead, it's sort of like, hey, if you really are obsessed with getting into a school that turns away most of their applicants, I guess this can be one of my choices, right? And there's something lost there. But that is not what we are here to discuss necessarily. I would love a little bit more about, what defines a book as great? How does it make the list of books that students wind up reading if they attend St. John's?
Yeah, that's maybe the toughest question you could possibly ask a Johnny. Our curriculum goes back to 1937, and so in 1937 we had some real reformers in the educational reform movement across a number of different colleges who were really interested in putting away notions of looking at textbooks and going to lectures and passively receiving information, and instead having students go back to original sources and for themselves suss out the ideas from these great authors and to make conclusions about those ideas on their own. And so 1937 was this key juncture for us when we adopted this curriculum. And many of the books you see on our curriculum are reflective of that moment. There are, when we first were founded, there were no authors, of course, who could have been more recent than 1937. Yep. And so over the years since then, we're continually adding new authors and we're rethinking the books that are already in the program. Some of these books are timeless and they're never going to go anywhere. I mean, we've been talking about Homer's Iliad and Odyssey for 3,000 years, and we will
Yes.
continue to talk about those books for 3,000 years. We know they're great because they've influenced so many other authors who have followed them in all
Hmm.
sorts of disciplines. Other authors, though, maybe more controversial, or they may be great in some ways, but really flawed in other ways. And when we talk about great, we don't mean good necessarily. What we
Hmm.
mean is often this expression that we use, that the authors and the books should be both timeless and timely. We're
Mm.
looking for books that stand the test of time, that they might be 3,000 years old, and yet they still speak to us today. And that timeliness is about the issues we grapple with as human beings, whether they're scientific or political or psychological, whatever those issues are. We want authors who speak to them in our modern capacity. And so as we, every year passes, our community, our students, our faculty are always discussing the books that are in the program, and everyone's vying for the book they believe that must be added because it is so essential to understanding the human experience. And yet anything we add to the program means that something has to come out because it is packed. There's over 200 books.
Right.
And so we make tough decisions sometimes to either not include a new book or to include a new book and remove an old one. And more recently, you can see some of the authors we've added have been people like Toni Morrison, Simone de Beauvoir. We've added more recent books in biology and in physics. We've in some of the elective classes we read authors in computer science like Alan Turing, the
Hmm.
founder of the field of computer science. And so you see these places in the late 20th century in particular where we're starting to add in order to kind of round out all of these authors who are great and yet need to speak to a new set of experiences that all of us are having today in the modern world.
Well, I mean, so many questions, and we don't even have time for all of them. But I have to imagine, and certainly feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, that in 1937, the list of great books was written by mostly men and probably mostly white men. And so that has probably necessitated quite a bit of, thinking outside of that fairly narrow framework. One question that I have for you is, you mentioned there are 200 books on the list. Does every student who graduates and goes through 4 years read all 200 of those? They,
They do, and so
interesting.
in most respects, all of our students are doing this curriculum together as a shared experience. And so you're starting freshman year roughly chronologically in the ancient Greek world. You're starting with Homer, with reading the Iliad and the Odyssey,
Hmm.
and then over time you're reading into the modern world. And so, and like I said initially, this is interdisciplinary, and so we often think of great books and we think of great literature, but what we talk about includes history and philosophy. It includes politics and law. It includes math and science. We're reading original authors in all of those fields. And so from freshman year in the ancient Greek world to senior year, coming into the modern world, you do see this real growth of diversity of the authors across the program. I think it's an area we still have a lot of work to do on.
Hmm.
As you mentioned earlier, in 1937, the curriculum looked much more male and white than it does today. But I think we still are working to make progress on that question. And you see it reflected in many of the authors that we read more in the more contemporary world toward senior year. I mentioned one of our more new authors is Toni Morrison, but you also see that kind of diversity reflected in people like W.E. Du Bois, who spoke on our campus in the 1950s. You see it in James Baldwin. You see it across our graduate program as well, where we have a graduate program in Eastern Classics, which focus on great books from the traditions of China, India, and Japan. And so I said, for the most part, people are sharing all of this together.
Right.
And yet there are a few opportunities senior year and in junior year where students have an elective class. And so there's an opportunity for them to dive into a particular book or an author, an idea they want to spend a little bit more time on. That might be different from what many of their peers are doing. And yet they're coming at that toward the end of their St. John's experience because it's all predicated on this foundation of having read all of these great authors who likely informed the ideas that we think of by those more modern authors in the world we live in today.
I mean, it's a totally, totally fascinating sort of approach to this level of education. All, And I understand that it has its roots in the way that education used to be for the few people who undertook a more rigorous education after kind of the basics were out of the way. I'm curious, does everyone have the same major? Do people major in different things? How does that piece work at St. John's?
Yeah, there is, in fact, only one major at St. John's. Everyone graduates with the same degree, a Bachelor of Arts in Liberal Arts. And it's an interdisciplinary degree because we're studying all of these different subjects through reading these authors. And so, and that is very unusual. It's another way I
Yes.
think some people would describe us as being a niche.
Yes.
Sometimes we frame it this way: that if you were try to break our curriculum into more conventional pieces and ascribe majors and minors to them, you'd probably say every student at St. John's graduates with a double major in philosophy and the history of math and science, and a double minor in literature and classics. And so that
Okay.
is, those four buckets encompass a lot of the curriculum. They're the biggest parts of the curriculum. And yet we still talk about our Bachelor of Arts in Liberal Arts as this interdisciplinary degree that really defies these conventional boundaries between disciplines. At any other college you would go and there'd be departments and you'd have professors who have studied in that department, who are teaching their specialty, and they may not know what's happening in the math department if they're in the English department. And yet at St. John's, all of our faculty teach across the curriculum. And so you may be someone with a PhD in English literature teaching a math class. And we want that diversity of viewpoint across all of our subjects, and to break apart the disciplinary boundaries and make people think in this interdisciplinary way.
Yeah. I mean, again, totally cool. But as you talk, I'm thinking this might be something I would be interested in doing as an adult, would definitely not have been something for me as a teenager. It just not really wouldn't have fit the way that I learned or wanted to learn, probably more importantly. And I'm curious not only who is drawn to the program, but also what do graduates do? As I know many of our listeners are parents, and they might think, wow, this is cool, but where does my kid go from here?
Yeah, two really good questions. I think on the first question, the kind of student who's drawn to St. John's generally loves to read. They love ideas. They want to read about those ideas and they want to talk about them a lot. We have no lectures here. And so every single class will be a discussion about these books. So people who are excited for the reading and the discussing, that's a big piece of this puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle tends to be students who love ideas across disciplines. We're not a place where you can come and solely study literature or solely study politics. You're going to study those subjects, but you're going to study them alongside all of these others, really 24 different subjects. And so students tend to love lots of different subjects in high school and can't decide. They also really want to, they really want to explore these ideas in depth and be a part of an intellectual community that's sharing this experience together. I think that's actually one of the most exciting things about St. John's, is the fact that students come here for the program. They're not coming because of our great athletic teams. They're not coming
Right.
for the lazy river. They're coming because they want to be a part of a community that is excited to talk about Plato and Homer and Toni Morrison as they are.
Right.
And that culture, I think, permeates every aspect of St. John's. What they do after they leave here, though, that might be something that we could talk about in a moment.
Yes. I think that's probably, I mean, for sure, we want people who are thinking about this to know that, yes, this would be a fit for me. But I am curious about that. Like, where do you go from there? As an English major, I have my thoughts on where you go from there. And my thought is probably wherever you want, right? You're not necessarily, you can't go work as an engineer tomorrow necessarily because you might not have the credential that allows you to do so. But you could read, write, and think, and that prepares you for virtually every career that you could do.
Yeah, I mean, our graduates, I think the hallmark of what they have leaving here is that they have learned to grapple with really complex ideas. They've done it in an interdisciplinary way. They know how to communicate with their peers, both orally and in writing. We do a lot of writing. And so on the other side of this degree, you're someone who is prepared to tackle the problems of the modern world without having been prepared for a specific career. And I think that's a pretty essential thing. I mean, we know that most graduates will leave college no matter where they go, and they will not work in the field that they majored in.
Yeah.
And they will be dealing with problems that didn't exist when they were in college. And so who makes the best graduate to tackle these modern problems? It's not the person who's been trained to study one specific thing. It's the person who's been trained to think and to read and to write and to connect with peers. And that skill set translates to all sorts of careers, of course. I think one of the biggest things you see emerging from St. John's will be students who are going to graduate school of all sorts. I mean, we are one of the biggest producers of PhDs by percentage in the United States. That's true in the humanities, it's true in the sciences as well. We send a lot of people on eventually to be teachers, whether that's in other universities. We have a lot of people who are professors, but we also send a lot of people directly out of St. John's into teaching in high schools. We produce a lot of journalists, people right now I know at the Washington Post, at the New York Times. Lydia Polgreen is a relatively recent grad who is a really prominent opinion writer at the New York Times. We have interesting career paths you wouldn't expect for instance, winemaking. One of the most important vineyards in Napa Valley was founded by a Johnny, Warren Winiarski. And he is someone whose name you might not know, but you probably have heard of his wines because rather famously, it was his wines that won the competition in the 1970s of California wines versus French wines and really put all of California winemaking on the map. And so you see this extraordinary diversity in what our students are doing. A lot of people have gone to law school, a lot of people who go on into business, but we want that diversity because we want to be the kind of place where students are excited about ideas and bring that into all different career paths.
Right. So none of what you said surprised me about what people end up doing. And, for sure, there are people out there who understand and appreciate the liberal arts. And then there are people who are focused on college as the next step in a specific career path that they're taking. And there's certainly room for everyone in this. And I think you've laid out pretty effectively the space that St. John's fills. And like you say, not trying to be everything to everyone. There are specific students who are going to be drawn to what you do. Very quickly, because we're almost out of time, I did want to give a space for you to mention you have a new tuition model that I like a lot, and that winds up meaning that St. John's costs about what it would cost you without financial aid to attend an out-of-state public. That's my experience. As my son is in an out-of-state public, and when I looked at the price points, they're very similar to what St. John's is at right now. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So St. John's has two campuses, which is another unusual thing about us. One campus in Annapolis, Maryland. That's our historic campus that in fact goes back to 1696. We're the third oldest college in the country. The other campus, Santa Fe, New Mexico, created in the 1960s. And both these campuses do the same program. We're one place where students might move between the campuses. And as a result, we have the same financial model where we in 2018 chose to lower our tuition from what had once been over $50,000 to what it is today, which is roughly $37,000. And that drop of tuition was predicated on a conversation we were having with our own alumni about college affordability and their own fear that at some point St. John's would become out of reach to the people who love it most. And so we did a lot of reflecting on this and chose to lower our tuition at the same time we started a capital campaign. And I'm happily now delivering the news that at this stage in our capital campaign, it gets close to its conclusion. We have raised over $300 million.
Wow.
And that $300 million is going solely for the purpose of lowering our tuition to make the college more affordable for any student who applies and increasing the amount of need-based financial aid we also give out to ensure students from every background can afford this place. And we have a pretty extraordinary socioeconomic diversity at St. John's. We have students who come here who can afford our full tuition, and that is great. We have other students who really could afford very little of it. And in fact, we have 23% of our students in the current freshman class who are Pell Grant recipients, which is a real strong reflection of that socioeconomic diversity that is so essential to a college that is a discussion around the table where different viewpoints, different perspectives, different backgrounds have to inform the conversation about these great books.
Yes, I love it. I love for our listeners out there, if you want to learn more about this, you can Google St. John's tuition program and it should pop up for you. But I love the philosophy behind it. And certainly I love the price point and the idea that let's get rid of merit aid, which really at the end of the day is just discounting. And let's focus on making it a reasonable price point for those who can afford it, and then putting the emphasis on financial aid for those that can't. Ben, I so appreciate you joining us for the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're answering your questions. So you know you don't want to go away because we might be answering your specific question. We'll be back in just a minute.